So I hope you guys all enjoy it, and I just want to talk a little bit about history and stuff going on there, some topics that came to my mind. We just recently hit 3,500 subscribers, and so I am very, very happy for all of that, very, very blessed by that, and really appreciate it. You guys are the friendly neighborhood historians, and I'm just bringing you a little friendly neighborhood history. And I've been doing this for almost 6 months now, and the support, the feedback, the positive reviews, the suggestions, the constructive criticism, can't thank you all enough for it. It's really been fun. I had no idea that this was going to go anywhere. I just decided to do a history video. My inspiration to do this was originally from my girlfriend, who said, you should maybe take all of this knowledge you know about history and put it out there, like put it on TikTok and YouTube. And since TikTok might very well be banned, I figured YouTube would be the better place to do it and branch out, you know, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, all of that stuff that people just love to do. So what's the point of friendly neighborhood history? Where did it come from? Well, like I said, I was driving with my girlfriend one night and I told her, I said, you know, I could name all the kings and queens of England right now, just off the top of my head. And she's like, don't tell me. Well, don't just tell me, tell everybody. Like, you can't just take all of this information you know about history and just like not share it. You got to like start spreading the word around. And so that's what I started to do. I started to do videos, and I did one video one time. I think it was like my first or second video. It was like President's Day weekend, perfect time to do a history channel, perfect time to start a history channel. And it was about, I think it was about like the Civil War and why the Civil War started or something like that. And I was really, really happy because the next day I had a whopping 300 views. And it's like, oh my gosh, 300 people actually watched me. And I know that's not a lot of people, and there's so many shorts, and it's so easy to access content. And I didn't even know about the 15 seconds versus 60-second shorts. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know green screens. I didn't know anything. So if you watch the first few videos I did, it's just me talking off the top of my head. I'm walking the dog, so I'm all sweaty and panty, like you've probably seen in multiple videos of mine. But I was just like, I remember waking up and I looked over at my girlfriend and I'm like, hey, we got views. We got views. And she was like, let me go back to sleep. Okay, so that was interesting. But basically, from there, I just started to figure out things and figure out that I wanted to do more history, and I wanted to do short videos, and I wanted to get as much information as I possibly could into each video. And I found out that the more I did it, oh, hello there, someone, the more that I did, the more people would come along and pay attention to it. And I remember I did one video, I think it was about Henry VIII, and yeah, and it was really, really cool, and it got like, I'm trying to remember exactly how many it got. It got like 10,000 views. And I'm like, okay, so I actually have something here, and it's something that could be really good, and it's something that could really, really work. So for those of you joining, and those of you who are making comments about like picking up on people and Trump and stuff like that, I don't really care. My channel is free to access. I'm talking about history. If you have any questions, this is an Ask Me Anything celebration, 3,500 subscribers. Like I was just saying, I never knew I would never get this far. So just please feel free to ask me anything you want about history, because that's what my channel is mainly about. Again, been doing this for almost 6 months now, and I'm just amazed with the amount of support I've gotten. I've made videos about tons of topics, and as you all know, I do a Today in History video every day. Yeah. Can I get a shout out, please? Yes, you just got a shout out. You're very welcome, Nexus Place. History of slavery. Bidenist history. You guys got some interesting stuff here. So history of slavery. I've got a good video on that, but basically slavery, to do a history of slavery, I need a lot more than a live stream that I plan to last for an hour. But basically, history of slavery. Slavery is a human institution that has always existed on every single continent. And the real first example of racially charged slavery that was perpetuated and continued because of racism was here in the United States, which is why the United States slavery gets such emphasis as it does in history. So do I think blacks deserve reparation? I'm going to stay out of political stuff and things like that as much as I can. I think there's obviously a lot that's gone on in history that's really wrong, and there's wrongs done by all sides in all ways. And so things like that are really important to talk about. And I think we should have discussions. So not sure if we should or not. Yeah, no, I'm not saying slavery started in the USA. It didn't start in the United States. Slavery has existed basically everywhere. And it's not that Europeans just went to Africa to get slaves. Europeans were already trading with Africans, and Africans started to give slaves as bonuses, and eventually the Europeans started trading in slavery from Africa. So the Europeans are probably the first example of someone having the technology to use ships to go to different continents and pick up slaves. And they did this by subjugating the Native Americans, unfortunately, and also enslaving Africans who were already being enslaved by African lords and chieftains. Yes, that's true. The first slaves were actually Slavic. That's where the term comes from. They're Slavic peoples, which is actually technically my people, so that's interesting. Yeah, so stuff like that. Which country am I from? I'm an American. Sorry about that. I have a lot on American history. I love doing history of all different types of countries and areas, so that's really important for me. Trying to look for some channels here. I did the history of slavery. Is The Many Wives of Windsor historical? I don't know. I haven't seen it yet, but I think I should probably watch it, so I'll probably try to at some point. I'm not trying to throw puke from my mouth. That sounds disgusting. Yeah. But anyways, so just some stuff about history. I wanted to talk about a few topics of my own. One thing that somebody recommended, what do you think about Hannibal and the Punic Wars? So Hannibal and the Punic Wars, really interesting topic. I think Hannibal got closer than maybe any other general to besting the Romans. And he did this by just trying to outflank them and outsmart them, and really ahead of his time and underrated. And he's underrated because he lost. But he didn't lose because he was a worse general than the Romans. He lost because the Romans just happened to have more people and more resources. And part of the reason they had the resources to win the Second Punic Wars against Hannibal was because they won the First Punic Wars and were getting tribute from Carthage. So, yeah. So that's what I think about Hannibal and the Punic Wars. I think it's a really interesting topic, and I think Hannibal really pulled off a fast one by getting elephants to climb over the mountains in Switzerland, getting into Italy, and he was just bested by the Romans, who sent Africanus into his own territory, forcing him to go back, and that's where he was eventually defeated. Yes, I know a lot about the Reformation of the Church. I'm glad you asked about that. I've done several videos on the Protestant Reformation. I think it's extremely important. Obviously, Luther seeking to reform the Catholic Church, at first from the inside, but realizing that it really wasn't going to work out if he reformed it from the inside, so he started to reform it from the outside. So that really changed everything, and eventually basically everybody followed Luther's pattern, and we end up with different Protestant churches splitting off from the Catholic churches. Obviously you have Luther and the Lutherans, which really Luther wins the influence of a lot of German princes who don't want to be under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, so they get really invested in Lutheranism, probably for political reasons more than spiritual ones. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, you have people like Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin. In fact, one of the inspirations for the Reformation, Jan Hus, I just did a video on today. I do a Today in History video if you haven't seen it, so please check that out. I am not talking against India. I love India. Am I with Palestine? I've done a couple of videos about that whole topic, and I think it's the history there. I will say either side is really complex, and it's not easy to answer it. There's so much history there, and that explains why people are so polarized about it and why things happen the way they do in that area of the world. What was Christ's name in the name of Jesus? So Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, was actually, his Jewish name is Yeshua, which is a translation of the word Joshua. They had the biblical character Joshua from the Old Testament who conquered the Israel after the Exodus. So that's where that comes from. Why don't the slaves want your underwear? Some of them did, some of them didn't. I don't know quite how to answer that. Yeah, I like what Crystal's saying. There's a lot of bad history out there. There's a lot of people who try to basically make history about agendas and answering it the way that they can, and not really looking at what actually happened. I had a professor in college who told me the real truth of the matter is that historians, our job as historians is to tell the truth. We tell the truth. And so as best as I can, whether it's about Palestine, whether it's about American history, whether it's about slavery, I do my absolute best to tell the truth. Are you with Russia or Ukraine? I definitely think, again, I don't want to really take sides. I don't want to get super political. I will talk about the presidential debate in a minute because I've been meaning to do that in my channel, but not from a political perspective. I do think that Russia is really setting itself up for a difficult century, like the 21st century, if it continues to antagonize the United States and the West. So places like France, Britain, things like that. What's your thought on French colonialism, Africa, and Algerian independence? I did a video on this just recently. Would love to do more on it. After World War II, basically, in order to get the Soviets away from Africa, the Americans believed that the best way to keep communism from spreading to Africa was actually by giving telling the Europeans, the French and the British especially, to let go of their colonies and give them self-determination, let them become their own democratic governments. Their hope was that by doing this, they would prevent them from becoming socialist and communist. England kind of went along with it. France, not as much. And Algeria really is an example of how France really could not hold on to a colonial power. They got their butts handed to them just as they had in Vietnam. Literally, right as they were losing in Vietnam, they get involved in fighting in Algeria, and they lose there as well. What do you think of Richard Nixon and the war on drugs thing? I think the war on drugs really hasn't worked, and I think we can tell that by our incarcerated populations and the way it's affected people, particularly people of color. I think there's different cultural things going on, but basically Nixon doesn't start it. It seems like presidents want to just kind of dogpile on it. So Reagan dogpiles on it, Clinton dogpiles on it. Presidents are doing a lot of that. Yeah, Russia isn't okay. Yeah, the United States has started plenty of wars, and I'm not going to start saying that America starting wars is necessarily a good thing. Yeah, I'm not going to say that, but can I say hello in German? I'm okay. I don't need to do that. Can you articulate how Chinese gunpowder ended up in the hands of powers like Britain? Simple. Trade and later colonization. And the Chinese had used gunpowder in fighting in their wars and obviously for celebrations and things like that. But it was really the Europeans who, by using guns and things like that, really perfected the use of gunpowder. Just like the Assyrians invented crucifixion, not the Romans. We think of crucifixion, we think of Jesus, we think of crucifixion. But the Assyrians actually created it. The Persians did it too. And it was basically hanging someone on a stake in the ground. The Romans created the T shape that we're used to seeing, and things like that. Yeah, do you have a degree in history? Yes, I have a bachelor's degree in history, and I'm just about to finish a master's program in history. And my goal is to get a doctorate one day in history. It's my passion. I've taught it a lot, really enjoy it, obviously, as you hopefully have seen from this channel. Why didn't Operation Unthinkable? I don't actually know a lot about that. I would need to look into that a little bit more. I don't know everything. It's just amazing. The more I study history, I learn one thing. The more I don't know about history. There's just so much to be able to learn about history and so much to understand about it. Looking through the comments here to see if there's any more questions. How does the Book of Mormon claim their timing of their book written? Yeah, the Book of Mormon, that's a good question. So according to Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, Israelites actually settled North America hundreds of years before Christ and set up communities here that were eventually wiped out by the Native Americans. And they basically, their holy texts were buried and hidden until they were revealed to Joseph Smith in the I believe it's the 1820s or 30s, something like that. So, will I stay in the act? So basically, Mormonism started well before the time of Jesus, and actually Jesus came to the New World after his resurrection, preached the gospel to the Native Americans and the Hebrew descendants who were there, and eventually, again, they were all killed off by different Native American tribes, and their holy text, the Book of Mormon, was hidden and eventually revealed to Joseph Smith. Have you covered the first emphasis of imperialism in the New Kingdom of Egypt and how it relates to civilization from that point? A little bit. I've talked about Kush, Nubia. I've talked about how Kush and Nubia actually were conquered at first by Egypt and then conquered Egypt. And today, the country with the most pyramids in the world is Sudan. And that is because of the rich trading empire that Kush built, especially after it conquered Egypt. Do you think history is repeating itself? I like how this guy said, history ain't friendly, bro. No, it is not. Is history repeating itself? To some extent, it does. I like what Mark Twain said. History doesn't repeat itself. It just happens to rhyme a lot. And I think that's really true. There's things in history where we see them happening similar to how they happened before. One example I've used on the channel before is the 20-year curse. Starting in 1840, with only really one exception, until 1960, basically every 20 years an American president would die or be assassinated. And people wondered where this was coming from and how this was happening, and people thought it was a curse. And it popped its head up again when Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981 at the beginning of his presidency, 20 years obviously after JFK had been tragically assassinated. And Reagan did not die, and no president has died in office in 60 years, and that has not happened in a long time. And so Americans haven't heard about the 20-year curse, but that could be a way that history is repeating itself. Why didn't the Inca conquer the Amazon forest? The Inca, something I find very interesting about the Inca and the Aztecs, we think about them and we think about them being there for a long time. They were actually relative newcomers, and their empires did not last that long. There were actually people groups that, especially, of course, the Mayans in Central America as predecessors to the Aztecs, but there were people groups in these areas for centuries and had long-standing civilizations. What the Inca managed to do was unite all of those civilizations and conquer and subjugate them and create an empire that really only lasted for about a century before the Spanish showed up. What is Talmud? The Talmud is a series of writings and commentaries, I believe on, it's Jewish writings and commentaries on the Torah, the first 5 books and the laws supposedly given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. Okay. Have you covered the first instances of imperial? Okay, I answered that one. Do you think? Where is the oldest original copy of Bible in which church? If I'm correct, the rumor is that it's in a church in Ethiopia. I'm not more sure about that. It's not our favor, I guess. Am I Mexican? Well, I'm not normally mistaken for that. I am European. I'm white. I'm very white. Dictatorship and how it came to be. So this is something that I find very interesting in history, is the idea of dictatorship versus a monarchy or autocracy. Monarchy tends to be family run, and it tends to rely on nobility. So you can't say that the English kings in the Middle Ages, on which I did an entire series on them, or the French kings or the Russian czars were really dictators, but they are people who are said to rule because God wants them to rule, and people need to obey them, and it's kind of all in the family. They pass it on to their family. Usually they try to pass it on to their eldest son or their oldest son who's still alive. But the truth of the matter is they rely more on their nobility and things like that, and you have feudalism in medieval Europe, and this is the case in other societies too. So kings aren't necessarily dictatorships. Dictatorship is a little bit more modern. Ancient Rome had dictators, and dictators would sometimes, contrary to modern understandings of dictators, ancient dictators in Rome especially would hold on to power, hopefully for a short amount of time, and then relinquish it back to the Senate, but they would dictate. They would use dictatorial power to help the Romans defeat their enemies. So it was a way to get quick, fast action with a commander-in-chief. It's actually the way the Americans set up their government, with the executive branch being the quick, fast action and commander of the military. Codex Sinaiticus, that's one of the oldest copies of the scriptures. Yeah, that's definitely true. That's the New Testament. Yeah, I don't know as much about Canadian history. I really want to know more because I want to do more videos about Canada and things like that. So that would be really cool if I could do that. Why are communist nations so poor but China so rich? So there's a few things to say about that. Many communist nations have been very, very poor. The Soviet Union was highly productive and actually produced an awful lot of steel and factories. I mean, that's where Stalin's name comes from, Man of Steel. So the Soviet Union actually had a lot of money, and they used this money to help buoy and support other communist countries, especially in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. However, their people and their standard of living for their people was very low compared to Western nations, especially the United States. So China has a communist society, especially in its culture, but its economics have actually fostered more free enterprise. and internationalization and international trade and things like that. Historically, is monarchy proven to be better than democracy? That's an excellent question, or is it early to judge? You could say when it comes to history that it's almost too easy. Oh, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Muhammad. But that's a great question, Muhammad. Is history proven to be better than democracy? Is monarchy proven to be better than democracy? I think that it's hard to judge things in history and say one thing is necessarily better than another. And maybe the historian's job is not to say that, but to report what happened and what it means. I think that there are ways in which monarchies have strengths politically, but I think that people tend to more and more, especially in the modern era, tend to want to think in terms of themselves, and they tend to want to think in terms of being able to elect their officials and vote on their laws. And so I think democracy is prevailing in the modern world, obviously. I think that's hard to debate. I don't know if it's necessarily morally better. I happen to believe it is. But there are drawbacks to any system. Economics is another field of study that I really love, and something you learn in economics is there are no absolute winners and losers. There are trade-offs. You get one thing, but you have to give up something else. So, yeah. Do you know how much on Roman Senate sponsoring poor individuals to go into Senate? Typically, the Roman Senate didn't like that because the patrician class was a family class, and they wouldn't try to let people in. But when they eventually created the office of a tribunal, that was a way that the lower families, the plebeians who ran the assembly, could get some representation in the Senate, and was a way for plebeians to eventually make it into the Senate. But there wasn't a whole lot of social mobility in Rome. Yeah. Do you think George Orwell's 1984 is starting to happen in real life? Yes, I absolutely do. I'm not going to get too political, like I've said before, but I think that you look at the abilities of technology to monitor us, and phones monitor us, cameras monitor us, things like that. There definitely is an Orwellian element to that, but it's not so much an authoritarian, totalitarian government run by a single communist political party like Orwell envisioned. There's a little bit of corporate influence, there's cultural influence, and things like that. And I think there are some Orwellian trends, and people seem to think that, especially with cancel culture and things like that. So, yeah, some cultures do have a collective views, and it's very interesting to see where the collective views come from, where individualistic ideas come from. We tend to think about things in history like capitalism, democracy, women's rights as just default, as obvious, but these things were not necessarily obvious in societies. I had a great professor who once told me that the history is a foreign country, and whatever history you study, you're studying the past, and things are different, and customs are different, and all sorts of things. Actually, interesting. That's a great question about women's rights. Definitely Sparta. Sparta educated their women. Their women were trained. Their women were very strong. Roman women were typically had some rights, but used in political arrangements and marriages. Women, compared to today, where we have women heads of state, women political leaders, women heads of businesses, you didn't see that as much in Rome's Athens and Sparta, obviously. But Sparta, the women were. I hate to use this adjective because I think it's overused, but yes, strong. Do you think Hitler influenced Nietzsche? I think you're asking, did Hitler comes after Nietzsche? And I've read Nietzsche. I actually don't see Nietzsche influencing the Nazis as much as some other historians do. I think there's definitely some truth that Nietzsche has a lot of power and strength in his writings that the Nazis really loved, but that's I don't know that he would necessarily find the Nazis to be something that would be good, obviously. Could the Mongols conquer Europe if they wanted to? Yes, they could have. Yeah, I don't know if they stopped because they had to have a Kurulatai because of the death of their great Khanate, but they easily could have. I don't think Europe could have withstood the Mongols. The only places to withstand the Mongols definitively were Egypt, India, which eventually had a Mongol descendant become its emperor. That's what the term Mughal, the Mughal Empire, where we get the Taj Mahal from. It's a Mongol descended empire. And Vietnam. Vietnam, India, and Egypt were never, the Mongols tried to conquer them and failed. I don't know if they could have conquered Europe. I think they could, though. Where am I from? I don't know. I've mentioned being from America, but I'm going to leave that part off. Is first past the post voting really working? Is first past the post voting really working? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Anyways, let's see. Can you talk about the British conquering the Pacific Island nations in a military conflict context? Yes. So interestingly enough, the British actually get places like Tahiti and other. I'm trying to think. Did they get to Tahiti? Or I'm incorrect. Is it Bermuda? I'm thinking of. Definitely, they get Australia, and they get Australia and New Zealand, and they colonize those areas because they lose the 13 colonies. So they lose the 13 colonies, and then they decide to go into Australia and settle Australia. And they have a bunch of different wars against the Maori people, the Aboriginal peoples in Australia and New Zealand, and they end up being successful over them. And something to note about the British and the Europeans when they colonize Africa, they colonize Asia, and they colonize the Pacific Islands, they don't have more people. They don't have more men. They just use technology, especially post-industrial revolution, to overwhelm their opponents with their military strength. No, yeah, you're right. The Mongols do not conquer India. They try to and they fail. But the Mughal Empire is started by a man who is descended from the Mongols, and the Indian word Mughal means Mongol. Why did Britain try to reconquer? What they did. I saw a video. So some of my favorite YouTube channels that I think everyone should check out are History Matters. I get a lot of my English history from Tea Time with Lindsay Holiday. Spectrum does great videos. But History Matters did a video about that I really want to see and see if it's any good. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Tahiti is not part of the British. I got confused there. You're correct. They had Bermuda, though. And then, of course, they get Jamaica when they conquer it from the Spanish. That's actually where piracy comes from. The English invent our understanding of pirates. Pirates of the Caribbean, no less. Britain, I want to see that video by History Matters and see what they say. I don't actually think that Britain does try to reconquer America, although I would argue that the War of 1812 is definitely the British trying to impose their will on America. And it just seems like the United States, as time goes on, becomes more of an ally to the British, and they have a lot of shared values, and the British just turn their attention elsewhere. The Samoan Wars, I'll look into that. Did you know Africa used to be Mexico? I'm going to assume that's a joke. There is a video I've wanted to do for a while, and I apologize. I've been meaning to do longer length videos, and I haven't been able to get around to them. I have been so wrapped up in grad school stuff. But basically, the French tried to create an empire in Mexico in the 1860s, and it doesn't go anywhere. Napoleon III tries to put his son, not his son, I think it's his cousin. It's the son of the Austro-Hungarian emperor, and his name is Maximilian, and he becomes the emperor, and it fails mightily, and the Mexicans have a revolution, overthrow him, and kill him in the middle of the 1860s. So what do you think the world would really be like if Germany won World War II? I've heard this all my life. If the United States hadn't got involved, we'd all be speaking German. Maybe, maybe not. From what I understand, Hitler actually really liked the English and was very willing to give them friendly terms, and Churchill told him to go stick it you know where. But basically, if Germany had won World War II, I like what's his name? Great writer. Android's Dream of Philip K. Dick wrote Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. He wrote The Man in the High Castle about what would happen if Germany had won World War II. And basically, I think Germany would have created semi-autonomous states that basically promoted Nazi ideology, and there would have been a lot of resistance and revolutions. And so I don't think Germany could have extended an empire across the Pacific Ocean and taken over the United States and Canada, or even Great Britain and its colonies, but they would have basically tried to create puppet governments or governments that were very friendly to them in those areas. So I don't know what it would have been like. Obviously, Japan would have gained a significant stronghold in Asia. At the same time, I don't know how Italy would have done. Italy really is bad in World War II. Like, they're like French level bad. No offense to the French. I love the French. I'm just making a joke about the French. I love French history, but obviously the French get the Maginot Line, so they get the bad reputation. But the Italians really struggle in World War II, perhaps even more than the French to some extent. The Mongols did apply several generational war strategies to take the Ottoman Empire. No. The Ottomans actually kicked the Mongols out of the Middle East. The Ilkhanate, which ruled over Persia, is a Mongol kingdom in Persia. And like many Mongol kingdoms, it absorbs the culture. So they actually embrace Islam. They embrace speaking Farsi and writing a fancy calligraphy and building beautiful, symmetrical, geometric architectural feats that Islam is known for. And basically, the Ottomans throw them out. And eventually, you get the Safavids who take over there. And so the Mongols get thrown out of... never really could take over the Ottoman Empire, never really got anywhere there. How will history go if France conquered Mexico? It'd be very interesting. So Mexico has been conquered. I think you would have had a French empire in Latin America. I think you would have France be much more powerful. I think France would have been able to curb Germany's power in Europe, and we might have been able to avoid World War I, but it might have just looked a lot different with France being the bully that Germany was pre-World War I. I think that's a great question. I love the counterfactuals. I love the hypotheticals, and I think historians love to deal in those, but it's actually not what we're technically doing. If the Ottoman Empire didn't join World War I, they still alive? No. The Ottomans are falling apart before World War I, which is what kind of causes World War I, because you have all of these Balkan countries that get free from the Ottomans that kind of want to do their own thing. And Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia is like, no, we're big, so we're in control. And so I think that the Ottoman Empire was already falling apart. It's called the sick man of Europe throughout the 19th century. It's clearly being heavily influenced by the Russians, the Germans, the British, and the French. So no, I think that they would have fallen apart anyways. Let's see. Can you talk about the curious powers that controlled the Philippines? I don't know as much about Filipino history, unfortunately. There are limits to my knowledge, like I mentioned before. I did a video recently, and I found out in researching the video that the Philippines, who got its independence from the United States, became independent on July 4th. So right after World War II, once again in an effort to curb any communist argument that America is an imperialist nation. America gives the Philippines its independence. The Philippines had suffered mightily under the Japanese and mightily under the Spanish before the Americans show up, and under the Americans. They actually had a war where they wanted to get their independence, and America said no. So that's something there. On this knowledge after years of research. Really? I'm very interested in that, Jatney. Very interested about what you're saying about Mexico and Africa. Yeah, it's not quite Canada burning down the White House, Johnny. It's more Canada. The British. We actually tried to invade Canada during the War of 1812, and the Americans. It doesn't go well, and the British recompense the Americans by burning down the White House. And a lot of Americans like to think of that war as where we got the Star-Spangled Banner, and where Andrew Jackson became famous for winning a victory in New Orleans, which was a battle that shouldn't have happened because he was already supposed to have given up. But basically, it's a embarrassingly bad war for America. The Capitol is burned. Madison has to run away from the White House. Yeah. Why didn't Germany conquer South America? So Germany is... Well, South America is obviously divided before the 1500s begins by Portugal and Spain. And Spain has a lot of countries there, and eventually the Dutch and British get there. Germany is a little late to the colonization party, although they play a lot of great catch-up. Because most of the 19th century, after Napoleon, Germany is trying to create its own country. And you're trying to figure out if the Austrians or the Prussians will unite Germany, and eventually it's the Prussians under Otto von Bismarck. If you can give your thoughts on whether religion influenced history or historical events, and to what extent, and how historians seek accuracy and middle ground in logging from religious resources. Yeah, that's a very good question, another excellent question. Basically, when you look at religious sources from a historical perspective, you are looking at a reflection of the cultures in which the religious resources were written. And so you're looking at Muhammad unifying the Arabian Peninsula under one banner, and rather than a polytheistic society, you have him reconstructing that society around a single deity who doesn't have an image like all the other gods, who doesn't have an idol. And so you have that, for example. And when you look at the history of Christianity, you obviously have the ideas of Christianity spreading through evangelism, going all throughout the Roman Empire, and basically Christians believing in high birth rates and families and things like that. Eventually, they're able to outpace the Romans, and basically, by the time Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, that's just acknowledging something that's already factual. So when historians look at religious resources and religious information, we're generally trying to see what came out of it and why was it written and what does it mean. And that's not to deny any of the historicity of various religions, but it is to say that religion is often a cultural resource. And obviously you have so much religion influencing so many things. You've got the Crusades, you've got the Century of Conquest, you have the Islamic Golden Age, you have the spreading of Buddhism to areas like Korea and Japan, and how China influenced those regions. Yeah, I'm not making ribs today. Can you talk about the Golden Age of Islam and the accomplishments? Yeah, so the Golden Age of Islam, we've got a lot going on. We've obviously got advancements in medicine. We've got advancements in science. We've got huge advancements in mathematics. We have algebra being invented. I'm trying to remember his name exactly. I'm going to probably butcher his pronunciation. Al-Khwarizmi inventing algebra. And basically this happens in a context where you have a peaceful society that's generally religiously tolerant. You have the Abbasids controlling North Africa, the Abbasid dynasty, an Islamic caliphate, and an Islamic state, and most of the Middle East, and obviously Mecca, Medina, and all those places, and ruling from Baghdad, their capital in modern-day Iraq, and they are facilitating this. So you have beautiful art, and you have calligraphy and writings and geometric, beautiful geometric patterns put on carpets and put in buildings, and calligraphy becomes this, not just writing nice, but just beautiful writing, making writing actual artwork. I heard we were supposed to go to war, but nobody sent messengers saying we were meeting up here. It kept happening back and forth until let's storm the Capitol. Are you referring to War of 1812? I'm not sure with that. Why did Germany conquer South America? What about what about the Italians? I'm kind of confused by that question. Yes, algorithms and yes, Al-Khwarizmi. I'm still probably butchering it. How Jesus came to stop the sacrifices given scapegoat. So that's religious thinking in Christianity. The idea is that Jesus is the final and ultimate sacrifice. And after the Jewish temple is destroyed about 40 years after Christ's death, the idea is that Christianity has replaced Judaism, and that Judaism, which relied on sacrifices throughout the Old Testament, can no longer perform sacrifices because it no longer has a temple. And so Christians argue that Christ is the final and last sacrifice. Didn't Alexander the Great say the Middle East is where empires go to die because it's unconquerable? So that's not Alexander the Great. I believe that's Churchill. I think that might be Churchill who said that. But you're probably referring to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. That's what, Churchill said that. And that's because Alexander the Great the Greeks could not maintain control of Afghanistan after Alexander the Great conquered it and then turned around. There's actually a semi-Greek empire called the Bactries who rule over Afghanistan for centuries. The British try to take over Afghanistan, doesn't go well for them. The Soviets and of course the Americans all try to do this, and it doesn't. No one has ever been able to conquer that region of the world. So quite some interesting stuff there. What happened if the Fourth Crusade went to Egypt? If I remember correctly, the Fourth Crusade is where they stopped in Constantinople and butchered the city and created a small transient kingdom, semi-Italian kingdom in Constantinople in Turkey. yeah, they could have gone to Egypt like they promised, but they got really angry, and it just shows the growing divide between the Byzantines, who are declining, and the Eastern Greek Orthodox Church and the Western Roman Catholic Church under the sway of the Pope. So there's some things there. Yeah. I think I've caught up on most of the questions, which is good. I wanted to talk about a couple of other things. Like I said, I was talking about the channel. Again, I appreciate all the support and all of you. Oh, you live in Istanbul. Very, very interesting. Constantinople, a lot of people think that Constantinople is actually its original name. It is not. It is a new capital for Rome that Constantine built, giving his name to it, but it was actually called Byzantium. And that is why the empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire, is called the Byzantine Empire. Are we in the era where major power is shifting? So this is more geopolitics than history, but I think a lot of people think that. A lot of people are starting to think of the United States maybe in decline, and they're starting to wonder if China is going to take its place. Yeah, he did. If you think about Alexander the Great, he conquered all the way to India. His troops stop and then turn around because they're too tired to keep going. And that's Alexander in a nutshell. And Alexander would have wanted to keep going. And then when he dies, basically his son could have taken over, but his generals weren't going to allow it. So they divide his empire into 4 pieces, and Seleucus takes the largest piece because he's the most successful. And eventually the Greeks just lose a hold of Afghanistan, and their empire doesn't really stretch farther than Persia. And eventually the Parthians are going to come out and create a new Persian empire after Alexander had defeated the Persian Empire of Darius. And that Parthian Empire is going to be a thorn in the Greek side and a thorn in the Roman side that they can't ever conquer. Can you talk about the history between Ireland and the other Isle, the modern states of the 2 groups? A little bit. Ireland, obviously, something I'm learning just recently about Irish history is that we talk about genocides, and we talk about the genocides in terms of the 20th century, but it could be argued, and some historians argue, that the 19th century potato famine, where Britain continued to take potato crops from Ireland, extract it from Ireland, which was basically a colony of the British, and use it to feed the British, eventually led the Irish to starving to death and millions of Irish people dying and millions more fleeing, and most of them came to the United States. Ireland has had a long history of resisting the influence of both England and Scotland. Both England and Scotland tried to build plantations and farms there throughout the Middle Ages in order to exude their influence and claim lands for them. And the Irish just kept rebelling. And actually the English, despite all of their efforts by their kings, many of their kings claiming the title of the Lord of Ireland, it wasn't until they got rid of their king for 20 years. The British actually have gotten rid of their king. It wasn't 20 years, about 10 years. During what's called the Interregnum, that Oliver Cromwell led the British Parliament and the New Model Army, as he called it, to conquer Ireland and integrate it into Great Britain, and that eventually became the United Kingdom. So a little history there about Ireland. Yeah, Crystal, what makes Alexander great is that he did it in such a small amount of time, and whenever he needed a victory, he won it. And William the Conqueror conquered a smaller amount of land and wasn't as successful, but William the Conqueror is definitely underrated in history. If America hated communism, why didn't they conquer the USSR before they got nukes? That's definitely the thinking of George Patton. Patton definitely thinks that the United States should have just gone in and taken over the Soviet Union. I think Americans were very war wary. They didn't want to continue to engage in war. They also knew what it cost to invade and take over Russia. And also a lot of Americans thought the Soviets were our friends. They thought that Joseph Stalin was kind of a nasty guy, but at least he'd help us win the war. They made the mistake of thinking that the enemy of their enemy was their friend, when really the enemy of their enemy was just another type of their enemy. Yeah, if Alexander never dies, I don't know what happens. I don't know what kind of leader and ruler and administrator he was. Great conquering generals are not necessarily always great kings. Richard the Lionheart is maybe the greatest English warrior king. Spent 6 months in England in his 10-year reign and really doesn't do anything for England. You also have Julius Caesar. Isn't really able to control and administrate as a dictator over Rome. Do you think God is real, or is it just a story? I happen to believe in God. I'm not going to get too much into religion, though. Thoughts on lords and clans of the Anglo Islands during the Middle Ages before. So one of my videos that I'm probably most proud of, that I never expected to go viral, one day I just decided to make a video about England, and I called it Ancient England, and it's really England in the early 800s, but it's gotten hundreds of thousands of views, and I'm very proud of it, just because it just hit the right algorithms, I guess. I don't know. Talks about how there are so many different tribes and so many different clans. I dare to use the word diverse when I talked about them, and people have been asking me about that on that channel, on that video many times. But there really is a lot of going on. There's so many different clans and groups in English history, and even in Scotland. You've got the Picts, you've got the Jutes, you have things like that. You have the Anglo-Saxons are not even the original inhabitants of the island. They come from Germany and settle in that area. And this is before, well, hundreds of years before the Vikings come over, and hundreds of years before the Norman conquest. So, my take on the power shifting regarding to, interesting. You're descended from William the Conqueror. That's very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you for the subscription. I appreciate it. This is a good question about why did the Romans win in Gaul but fail in Germany? Well, there's several things to be said about that. One of the big things is the Romans win in Gaul because Gaul is a little bit closer. They have a longer standing influence there. They do get close to conquering Germany, but there are so many different Germanic tribes which rely on migration and moving around that the Romans are just not successful. And after the Varus's disaster at the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, basically the Romans decide that it's better to actually just keep the Germans from invading than it is to actually conquer them, because that's way too much money, way too much bloodshed, and it's really not worth it to have all that land. Yeah, so let's see. During World War I, we're the reason why the Geneva Convention exists. That I did not know. I do know the Canadians have a huge part to play in D-Day, and the Canadians, obviously, whenever the British go to war, the Canadians are there too. So World War I, you have that going on, and same thing in World War II. I don't know as much. Again, Canadian history is something I don't know as much about, and I want to learn more about. So if anyone has any good resources there, I'd really appreciate it. I think I've caught up on questions. I was going to talk a little bit about a couple of topics that were just coming to mind that I've talked about in the channel before. Again, thank you all for the support and everything. One of them was, I mentioned this on the post that I put up before I did the live stream. One of them was Queen Victoria. I've done a couple of videos about her. I have a full-length video about her because the short I was going to do, you can't just have that much information about such an important monarch and put it in a minute short. You have to make a fuller length video. So it's only 2 minutes long, but I recommend it. I really enjoyed doing that. And I find her to be such a fascinating character. Ruled over England at the height of its power, really just a figurehead. But when you think about power and influence, it's hard for historians to talk about and judge figureheads, but Victoria has a lot of power and influence. And despite the fact that she's not making the laws and not making the decisions and not making the rules, in a way she kind of is, because Parliament, the country, the empire, all kind of depend on her thinking and where she's coming from. So there's a lot to go off of there. And she rules for 64 years, and it's at her height of her power that the sun never set on the British Empire. And what that means is that basically from Canada to South Africa to Australia to Hong Kong to India, the British have a colony. They have a colony on basically every continent except Antarctica, of course. And because of that, it doesn't matter what time of day it is, wherever you are, you might be in a place where the sun is up and you are part of the British Empire. And people give the British Empire a lot of flack, and rightfully so, in my opinion, for many ways and many reasons. But the extent of Victoria's power and influence and the extent of Britain's wealth, and the main reason this happens is because they're able to industrialize before the French and the Americans and the Germans. It's just phenomenal. And she, meanwhile, in her own personal life, she's having this amazing love match with her husband, Albert. And she's married to him for about 20 years, and she has 9 children. And she just describes in detail how captivated she is by him, how entranced she is by him. And meanwhile, her country is just expanding at a rapid rate and becoming amazingly powerful. And Interestingly enough, I've talked about this before, there's a whole age of sophistication and conservative behavior and basically what England is known for, the manners, the pomp and circumstance that comes from her reign and her time as the monarch over England. And interestingly enough, the store chain, I found this out recently, I did a video on it, Victoria's Secret this is named after her, because here's this conservative queen who, especially later in life, appears all in black and everything, and is very tempered in her behavior and all of that. It's this idea that she has a secret, and then there's all this negligee and lingerie. So interestingly enough, she actually appeared in black later in her life because after her husband died, she refused to appear in public at all for 10 years. And it was actually a British prime minister who brought her out of hiding and tried to get her in front of the public eye and tried to use her as a way to show Britain's splendor and grace and power. And so the age is named after her, the Victorian age, despite the fact that she never really made any laws. And so I found that to be really fascinating, so I want to talk about that first. And I've seen a lot of questions, so I'm going to answer some of them. Is Kiev older than Russia? Statement accurate. Is Kiev, sorry, Kiev. That's a great question. And the reason it's a great question is because the Kiev and Rus, in many ways, are assumed to be the original Russian people. And they start with the settlement of Kiev, where you have Slavic peoples intermarrying with Viking raiders who eventually adopt the Orthodox Church, Orthodox Christianity as their faith, and so they're tied to Constantinople and the Byzantines. In a way, Kiev is older than Russia in the sense that Russia doesn't exist as a country at that point, and you really don't get the establishment of the Russian Tsardom and the later the Russian Empire until Peter the Great. For centuries, it was called Muscovy because Moscow replaces Kiev as the most influential part of that area, as the most influential city. That's when the Mongols, so the Mongols actually in the 1200s come in and conquer Russia and oversee it for 2.5 centuries. And during that time, Moscow becomes the most important city, replacing Kiev. But for centuries before that, Kiev was the most important city for the Kievan Rus. So in a way, I like to consider them to be Russians, proto-Russians at the very least, but that doesn't, but in a way, Kiev is older than Russia. And I think I answered the stuff about Ukraine. Can you talk about the history of dogs and selective breeding? I don't know as much about that. I'm not a biologist. All I know is that dogs are adorable, and you guys have seen me do dogs on my channel before, and I have the video with my dog with the bag on his head. So yeah, I love dogs. I just don't know a lot about them. Obviously, I do know a lot about how they have been used in warfare. The Romans loved to use dogs in warfare. What did Tibet do during the Chinese warlord era? Not sure. Don't know much about Tibet. I know more about the recent history, obviously, with China annexing it in the 1950s, and it's the struggles to free that country. When you say Arminius, who are you referring to? There are many historical figures named Arminius. I mentioned the Philippines history. I wish I knew a little bit more about that. Median is Kurdish, more or less. The Medo-Persian Empire is definitely very powerful and very strong, and that's the correct name. I was referring to the the Persian Empire of Darius. That's the correct name for that empire. That's the one that Alexander eventually defeats. History of slavery. I mentioned this earlier on the stream, but in order to do a history of slavery, I would need basically several hours of this, and not a Q&A. But slavery, again, has existed in different forms, in different ways, as I talked about earlier in the stream, throughout human history. There are slaves all throughout human history. There was slavery in Africa long before the Europeans showed up. There was slavery in the New World long before the Europeans showed up, and there was slavery in Europe long before long before the Europeans established slavery in plantations in North and South America. And slavery was often a consequence of war. People would take slaves from their warfare and use that as a prize. And when you take slaves from your enemies during warfare and during battles, you actually depopulate your enemy and you take away their manpower, so you actually have a hold over them, and you have obviously the free labor. Slaves in Central and South America, especially during the time of the Aztec Empire, were used as human sacrifices. When you sacrifice your enemies, you once again, not only do you have slaves, but now you are actively depleting the manpower of your enemies and keeping them inferior. And this happened in that area, but requiring slaves as tribute is a common punishment, especially in the ancient world, because you have slaves and you have them working for you, and you have your enemies indebted to you that way. Don't know as much about the mercenaries from Sicily. I do know that Sicily is, during the Punic Wars, especially the first Punic War, is this back and forth area between Rome, Greece, and Carthage. And so Sicily, later it's conquered by the Normans. The Muslims try to get there. There's a bunch of different people who have owned Sicily. The Byzantines owned Sicily. And obviously it's part of the Roman Empire. Sicily has been torn back and forth between different empires and kingdoms throughout its history. Varmina technology, I don't know what that is. Okay, please oil up. Okay, talk about the Anzatics in the war between Ottomans at Gallipoli. Something I find remarkable is that there was a period of time when both sides stopped fighting and shared food and buried the dead. Yes, there's several occurrences in that in world history. And also in World War I, something I want to talk about, maybe even make a video on, is during the first Christmas in World War I, there is actually pausing in the fighting, and there's actually a soccer game played between the Germans, the French, and the British troops. And of course, they would call it football. And so there's these pauses in action to honor the dead, to bury the dead, to remove the bodies, things like that. And Gallipoli is basically an embarrassment because opening up a new front on Ottoman soil was not a good idea. The better way, although this was also very costly and took a long time, was by going through Greece. And it takes Greece a while to get involved in the First World War. And so as Greece gets more involved in the war, the British and the French try to use them against the Bulgarians and the Austro-Hungarians, and especially the Ottomans. Why didn't Europe colonize Africa sooner? I think the Industrial Revolution makes the difference. And I think, and so because they industrialize at a fast rate, once they industrialize, they use their technology not just to get labor from Africa, but to start taking over Africa. Goku or Vegeta? Goku. If you could be a fly during any area and location to observe civilizations, where would you go and why? And I think this is a great question to start wrapping it up, because we're almost at an hour, and I really appreciate everyone being around for the Q&A. And make sure to subscribe, check out the information. I'm wanting to do this more often because I really just love the participation. I love the questions everyone's asking. If I could be a fly in there during any area and location to observe civilizations, where would you go and why? I think I'd probably, this is a tough one. I would say I'd want to be a fly during the French Revolution, because I promised to talk about this, because I love the upheaval, I love the optimism of the early part of the French Revolution. I just want to learn about the different factions, and I want to see the different factions, and I want to see how I would myself align. I definitely don't think I would be wanting off with everyone's head, and I don't think I'd be a royalist to the king while people are starving to death. But I really would want to see what's going on during the French Revolution, and maybe it would be unsafe for a fly, though, so I'm not sure about that. But yeah, with that, as a Canadian veteran from World, yes, that does sound like something very, very logical. And something about World War I, and then to a lesser degree World War II, is that all of the empires, they are world wars in the sense that everyone is fighting, and they're forcing their colonials to fight. So when Britain gets involved in World War I, India gets involved in World War I. When France gets involved in World War I, Vietnam gets involved in World War I. When Germany gets involved in World War I, I'm trying to remember, I believe it was Angola, and Mozambique gets involved in World War I. Thank you, I really appreciate that. Us Americans aren't always the best at history. That's because there's a less of an emphasis on learning history of other peoples and things like that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the compliments and the efforts, and I look forward to hearing your comments again, seeing you in more live streams. Tell all your friends and family. But anyways, with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and I really appreciate, again, all of the feedback and everything. Make sure to check out the channel, watch some of the videos and everything, and we will be doing this again, hopefully very soon. Yep, thank you. I hope to teach you all and learn from you guys about history, and I think I've learned some things today that I definitely want to look into. And so we have hit the hour mark. I'm looking forward to seeing you all in channel, and I hope you have a very, very great day. Take care.